I'm Tyler McBrien, Managing Editor of Lawfare, with an episode from the Lawfare archive for May 27, 2023. Earlier this month, a report published in Environmental Science and Technology estimated that half of Phoenix residents would need medical attention if a multi-day power blackout and heat wave struck at the same time, the likelihood of which is heightened by climate change. For today, I chose an episode from April 16, 2019, in which Benjamin Wittes talked to Melton about why we should think about climate change as a national security threat, the challenges of viewing climate change through this paradigm, the long-standing relationship between climate change and the U.S. national security apparatus, and how climate change may affect global migration. Needless to say, over 4 years after this episode aired, climate change is still a threat to national security.
I'm Michaela Fogel, and this is the Lawfare podcast, April 16th, 2019. Since November, Lawfare contributor Michelle Melton has run a series on our website about climate change and national security, examining the implications of the threat, as well as U.S. and international responses to climate change. Melton is a student at Harvard Law School. Prior to that, she was an associate fellow in the Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she focused on climate policy. She and Benjamin Wittes sat down last week to discuss the series. They talked about why we should think about climate change as a national security threat, the challenges of viewing climate change through this paradigm, the long-standing relationship between climate change and the U.S. national security apparatus, and how climate change may affect global migration. It's the Lawfare Podcast, episode 409, Michelle Melton on climate change as a national security threat.
Let's start with the premise. Climate change is a lot of things. We tend to think of it in terms of ecological consequences, effects on communities, particularly coastal communities, and impacts on all kinds of things. Why should we think of it in a national security context as opposed to either smaller or larger ways of thinking about it?
Sure. There are several reasons why we should think about climate change as a national security threat. The first is that it has a tangible and already present impact on military installations and readiness. And the Pentagon has been talking about this for a long time. Just this January, they released a report that was mandated by Congress on which of their U.S.-based installations are vulnerable to sea level rise, increased wildfires, even severe weather, erosion from storms. So it definitely is already having an impact on military installations and has an impact on military readiness. So for that reason, military leaders have consistently said, both in the Trump administration and in the administrations preceding the Trump administration, that climate change is a national security threat. There's another reason why people say that climate is a national security threat, and that has to do with the impact of climate change on stability, especially in places of the world where there's a lack of governance capacity. And there's four basic scenarios that are discussed. Scenarios may be the wrong word, but four basic reasons or vectors through which climate change is expected to impact stability. And the first is threats to food security, which may result in competition among land use and the use of food as a political tool, which could threaten places that are suffering from food insecurity, but could also affect places like China, which is very vulnerable to drought and high temperatures, which all affects, obviously, agricultural production. The second is the impact on water resources. And this is both an issue internally to countries, but also internationally. There are about 200 river basins that are multinational, and about 13 have 5 or more nations that form part of the watershed, which could lead to international tensions or competition over water resources, such as we've seen in the Jordan and Euphrates rivers in the Middle East, the Nile, Zambezi, and Niger rivers in Africa, the Ganges in Asia, and to a lesser extent, the Colorado River Basin in North America. So there have already been concrete examples in the past of countries using water as a weapon. So, for example, North Korea dammed a tributary of the Han River above Seoul, which the South Korea worried would be used to threaten Seoul. And there were also recent concerns that ISIS would blow up a dam in Iraqi territory that they controlled, flooding Baghdad. So there's concern that those types of incidents may increase, but there's also concern about decreasing water availability within countries, leading to instability. The third sort of what I called scenarios, but are less scenarios than just issues, is competition in the Arctic over shipping and resource development. As ice in the Arctic melts and becomes less seasonal, we are already seeing an increase in interest among both Arctic littoral states and non-littoral states such as China in the Arctic. And that's, again, about shipping and resource development. And the fourth really big internet issue challenging international stability is migration from sea level rise and other issues, including some of the issues that I already mentioned, like food insecurity. So in the medium term, these issues are really exacerbating existing issues over stability in the world, and it's probably manageable, although there will be a lot of suffering. But the big question is this going to be incredibly destabilizing over the next 100 years? What happens when some of the world is no longer habitable, if and when that happens? What do we do with the people, and how does that impact international stability?
So normally when we talk about a national security threat, there is a bad guy. You know, when we talk about ISIS as a national security threat, the implication is that, you know, there are some bad guys who want to do bad things that are adverse to our interests, right? When we talk about nation state national security threats, some state is doing something that is adverse to our interests in the national security arena, which we think of as, you know, bad and requiring confrontation. One of the oddities of talking about climate change through a national security lens is that this element is missing. And it does amount quite literally to a chain of events in which kind of atmospheric, in this case literally atmospheric conditions, create conditions that exacerbate other national security problems. Is it fair to say that this is a situation in which, you know, there really isn't a bad guy and is thus kind of challenging to think of national in a conventional national security vocabulary?
Sure, that's a great question. And that is a critique that has been raised actually decades ago by a political scientist named Daniel Dudney, who is at Johns Hopkins. And he says, like you say, that environmental problems generally and climate change specifically do not really fit within a national security paradigm. And he outlines several reasons for that. He says analytically and conceptually, but also organizationally, it doesn't really make sense to link national security and environmental degradation. He says, basically, not everything that causes a decline in human well-being is a national security threat. The scope and source of environmental and national security threats are different within a national security context than they are for environmental problems. And as you said, the degree of intention involved is different. So environmental threats are largely unintentional side effects of routine activities like driving your car. And the organizational and bureaucratic structures necessary to address national security problems is different than the organizational and bureaucratic structure that you need to address environmental problems. So, for example, national security threats generally involve secretive, hierarchical, and centralized organizations, often removed from civil society, in contrast to the bureaucratic response of environmental organizations. So the criticism, I take it, is about the threat, but it's also can be boiled down to simplistically and perhaps unfairly, not everything that causes damage is a national security threat. And calling something that threatens life, property, or well-being a national security threat drains that term of its meaning. I think that there's a deeper truth there, and this is not Dudney's thought, this is my thought, which is that national security institutions exist not just to identify threats, but to combat them. And so we're sort of uncomfortable saying that this should be a national security threat, or some people may be uncomfortable saying that because there's no amount of military firepower that will stop climate change.
In fact, military firepower by burning fossil fuels contributes to climate change.
That is certainly true, although it is not the primary contributor. So I think that is true as far as it goes, it's hard to see the military or the intelligence community as a useful tool in blunting the direct threat of climate change. So I definitely agree that there is a mismatch there. And I think I have two responses. On the one hand, I think that that is true as far as it goes, but that doesn't change the fact that there is a threat, and that threat is exacerbated by climate change, a threat to readiness and military installations, and a threat to global stability, which I outlined earlier. Those threats are real, and we shouldn't necessarily think only of climate change in a national security paradigm. Now, that's not to say that climate change doesn't fit into a national security paradigm, but I think that it's a totally fair critique to say there are limitations to thinking of climate change within this national security paradigm. And connected to this, Daniel Dudney, the political science professor that I was referring to, makes another point that I think is really useful for people who speak about climate change in a national security context, such as myself, to keep in mind, which is that efforts to harness the emotive power of nationalism to help mobilize environmental awareness or environmental action could actually be counterproductive. So people and environmentalists and national security people who say that the linkage may not be descriptive, right? Climate change is not descriptively, analytically, conceptually a national security problem for the reasons that you outlined. We don't really care because it has political utility. So we think that it's a way of stimulating action by cloaking an environmental problem in the urgency of national security. And Dudney's response, and I think that he's right about this, is that this is likely to fail, or it's as likely to fail as it is to succeed politically, because a national security paradigm is going to result in an us versus them mentality, which fits poorly with an environmental paradigm because, as you said, paraphrasing here, the enemy is us. The enemy is not China or India. It's everybody. It's us. It's you driving your car. It's me throwing out extra food that I have. So the reason that this may fail politically is for two reasons. The first is, if we think of climate change as a national security problem, as you suggested, we might focus on the pollution of other countries rather than looking at what we have done. And you really already see this quite clearly in the US with regards to developing countries like China and India. We blame them. Look at how much China is polluting. We can't do anything unless they do. So we sort of have already started blaming them as if that's exculpatory for our own actions. And second, when we think about climate change in a national security context, we may tend to retrench into nationalism when we really do need an international solution to this problem. And third, and this is me speaking, again, not Dudney, using the national security community to actually address climate change may be harmful to those institutions, as it likely requires them to undertake unfamiliar missions, including domestic missions, which may erode sort of the wall that we have built up in many places between especially the intelligence community and civil society domestically in the U.S.
All right. So in other words, descriptively, there is a deep-seated relationship or set of relationships between national security and climate change. That relationship is an uncomfortable fit, both descriptively and normatively, with what we traditionally think of as national security challenges. And there are substantial reasons why you might want to be careful about overframing this in the national security vocabulary. Is that a reasonable summary?
That's exactly right.
All right. And yet, one of the really interesting components of the work that you've done recently on Lawfare is this relentless cataloging of the degree to which the national security community has, unlike the current political leadership of the country, not been in denial about this subject, and how there is this pretty long and pretty consistent history of intelligence and military components identifying the various national security threats emanating from human-induced climate change. So give us a sense of that history and, to what extent is this a situation where, with all the caveats that we've just discussed, the national security community actually has its eyes pretty wide open on the subject?
Yeah, so the history goes back actually much farther than most people realize. Climate science is heavily indebted to the national security establishment and the Cold War more broadly. It was actually the military that funded the basic science necessary to understand climate change all the way back as early as the 1940s. And when I say that, I'm not saying that the military consciously was funding climate science back in the 1940s, but the military provided funding for basic geophysical research and set up and established weather monitoring networks and other data gathering, which was useful in developing the field of climate science, and in that way furthered scientific understanding in the field itself. So military patronage was absolutely critical for the development of earth sciences in general, but also specifically for climate science. And if you think about it, it makes sense. For the Air Force, understanding weather and atmospheric circulation is critical. Aviators need to know about conditions in the upper atmosphere. For the Navy, understanding the ocean, its surf and swell, its thermal and salinity characteristics is essential for the fundamental mission of the service. And oceanographic research is a critical component of climate science, which has been funded heavily, or was in the past funded heavily, by the Office of Naval Research. And understanding the climate and weather in the Arctic was critical to the success of military operations in the Arctic, which was an essential theater during the Cold War. For example, the U.S. had an Air Force base in Greenland, and therefore they really wanted to know what it was like to land on snow. And so they studied the properties and conditions of snow, and they figured out as early as the late 1940s that the Arctic was melting faster than anyone could have anticipated. They didn't know why, but they were funding research, all this geophysical research, which eventually led to a greater understanding of climate change. So to give specific examples, military funding helped establish the first carbon dioxide monitoring stations in Hawaii and Antarctica. And both the Office of Naval Research and the Atomic Energy Commission funded studies about the dispersion of radioactive particles after a nuclear explosion, which led to a breakthrough in our understanding of the carbon cycle. So there have been long-standing connections between the military community, the national security establishment, and climate science for many, many decades. And so the idea that this was new, or that the military has not been deeply involved in this is not accurate. And therefore, I think this sort of interest in readiness and physical systems made the military very early on aware of and contributed to an understanding of climate science. So that's just a sense of the deep the deep history, if you will. More recently, the military has long recognized the impact of climate change on national security. As early as the 1970s, there are unclassified CIA memos and military research on climate change and the impact of climate change on international security. So this issue has a long history, and what we're seeing now, an outspokenness of the military on these issues, is really about their commitment to their mission and the facts that they have been dealing with for a very long time.
You know, you have put together on Lawfare a number of military and intelligence assessments over a long period of time that, you know, show a consistent concern both on the sort of effects on individual bases from the military side, but also these geopolitical destabilization concerns that you articulated earlier have a lot of grounding in a fairly large volume of work product from both the military and the intelligence community. Is that fair?
Oh, yes. And so climate change has been listed in almost every annual worldwide threat assessment for at least the last decade. I can't speak to what's happening in the classified documents, but the Quadrennial Defense Review has listed climate change as a national security threat, and it is something that planners are integrating into their plans for bases. And it's not just the military, it's also Congress. Now, Congress has been later to the party than the military, but at the same time, that report that I mentioned a little bit earlier, which was released in January, about the 10 most vulnerable military installations, was required by Congress. And so I think there is a bipartisan concern about climate change on military readiness, as well as longstanding concern among pretty much every senior official in the military about the impact of climate change on their operations. I mean, just this week, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force testified that they were preparing for climate change. They see climate change as a threat. And he was not the only one. I mean, in the last month, I think it's 4 different military officials have testified in front of Congress about the impact of climate change on military operations. They all see it as real. They all see it as a challenge or even as a threat.
So this is not something that is a creature of the Obama administration. It has persisted into the current administration, even as the president calls climate change a Chinese hoax.
That's right. I think you see it as early as the George W. Bush administration in public documents. Now, that's not to say that there was a full embrace during the George W. Bush administration, but there were some reports, specifically a sort of notorious 2003 report that was commissioned by the Pentagon, that was done by outside people, that really considered sort of like black swan events or gray swan events that could trigger geopolitical instability. It is the Obama administration where you see a more public and consistent embrace of this, but that has really continued through the Trump administration, with pretty much no exception until the present. And those people who at present are contesting national climate change as a national security issue are really not military officials, or even, for the most part, political appointees in the administration. They have, for the most part, including former Secretary James Mattis, acknowledged the threat that climate change poses.
What about other countries? So you recently wrote a very interesting piece on Lawfare about Chinese recognition that their national security interests were being challenged by climate change. Talk a little bit about the sort of evolution of the Chinese attitude on this subject, and also of sort of how other countries, particularly countries with sort of active military postures, and think about threats emanating from this set of problems.
So there is a wide range of views about this in various militaries, and the Chinese have really, as we talk about in the piece, have changed their stance somewhat. And that change of stance is not because they only recently have come to see climate change as a scientific reality or scientific truth. They've accepted climate science for a long time, but they were very resistant to characterizing climate change as a national security issue. And that's because of their concerns about the impact that classifying it as such might have on their sovereignty. They are concerned about saying that climate change was a really big issue for them because they didn't want that to be used as a way to force them to essentially change their economic development model. China is the world's largest emitter, and their development is heavily reliant on burning very large amounts of coal and oil. And I think that they, for a long time, were concerned that if they admitted that it was a national security threat, or even just a threat that everyone should be asked to equally address, that they would have to change their behavior. And that was not something that they wanted to do, or at least not something that they wanted to do at the behest of other countries. So they've really resisted this characterization until recently. They have come to see that there are both domestic and international advantages to characterizing climate change as a national security issue, including diplomatic advantages. They see a huge gap that the Trump administration has opened up by announcing its intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and they want to fill that gap, and they see a lot of soft power benefits from doing so. Now, whether that actually changes their behavior is a different question, as we articulate in the piece. But I think that they have sort of come around on this issue. Other militaries have different perspectives. So New Zealand recently put out, I think it was a white paper on climate change as a national security issue. They are pretty much in lockstep with the U.S. military's view. They see it as destabilizing. They see concerns about their installations, about refugees, and about humanitarian crises. And so that is a concern. I'm not an expert on Russia, but my understanding is that the Russians don't necessarily see it as a national security issue. They see enormous benefits from climate change, including increasing agricultural land in their country. They will obviously become a more temperate country. They see advantages in the Arctic. And so I don't believe, although again, I'm not an expert, that they have embraced climate change as a national security threat.
I mean, it's interesting. I do think they have a plausible argument that for all the reasons that other countries are afraid of, not that much of the landmass of Russia is going to become uninhabitable as a result of climate change. But you could imagine large swaths of the Siberian areas as well as the Far East that are currently mostly uninhabitable from a Russian, for large numbers of people anyway, as well as the Russian Arctic becoming over reasonable periods of time habitable and productive in a way that is not cost effective for them to be productive now. Are they wrong about that?
I think, as with everything else when it comes to climate change, it really depends about the time period over which you're referring. So, yes, that is certainly true within any policy timeframe that we currently use. They're not totally wrong about that. I think at least in the next 50 to 100 years, or possibly even 200 years, they may be wrong about that if we continue to emit at the levels at which we're emitting. They may be wrong about that in the long term, because a lot of people may see exactly that and say, I want to move to Russia because that's that's where things don't look so bad. And so they may, again, this is completely speculative, but the time frame really matters here. And it may
You're envisioning major net migration from Bangladesh to the Russian Far East.
Yeah, I think that is certainly a possibility. I'm not sure that it's the most likely possibility, but I certainly think that, again, depending on the time frame over which you're looking, they may have it good, they may have it not so good. It really depends. And again, it's so hard to predict because all of the impacts, the social impacts of climate change are mediated through human institutions. So, it's entirely possible that people will want to migrate to Russia and they won't be able to, or that by then, I don't know, we have some other form of international organization in Russia as a country no longer exists in the form that we know it. I mean, again, we're talking over 200, 250, 300 years. It's obviously impossible to predict. But you're not wrong that in the short term, they look to be sort of winners from climate change. Similar with the Canadians, who obviously have a very different political stance towards climate change, but who also stand to benefit from a more temperate climate.
Right. The more north you are, the larger your land mass, the more you have to benefit from Arctic navigability, and the lower your population density, the more likely you are to at least have mixed feelings about this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's not to say that that it's all benefit for those countries. I think forest fires in the far north are likely to become more likely. The composition both of those countries are important exporters of timber, and the composition of their forests are likely to change. And there is a limit to agricultural productivity gains just by virtue of the farther north you go, the less sunlight you have and the more sunlight you have at certain times of year. So it's not like there won't be any negative impacts. I'm not trying to paint a picture where these countries only benefit from climate change, but yes, on net, they seem to be, especially compared to countries in the tropics, winners.
All right. So what turns on the question of whether we think about this in a national security context or not? So if you think about it in a sort of traditional ecological context, you say, wow, we have emissions that are driving changes that we cannot control and that are in the aggregate highly negative. We have disruptions to human communities as well as to natural ecosystems that could be, in both cases, severe or even catastrophic. And we have damage to the planet that, we don't necessarily know what we're doing. Therefore, we have to do something both in the way of adaptation and also in the way of controlling emissions or limiting emissions or reducing emissions. If you think about it in the national security context, it seems to me you say all of those same things with the additional caveat that and therefore bad things will happen in the national security arena, like greater instability. And so my question is, what does the use of this particular lens add to the conversation other than perhaps a sense of urgency? Because as you described earlier, you do harness that urgency, the urgency with which we think about national security issues, for better or for worse. You harness that, as well as it gives you talk about the impact on military facilities around the world. What else does this add to the conversation?
Yeah, that's a really great and difficult question to answer. I think the first thing is planning. I think that the military and national security establishment more generally needs to be aware of and think about climate change in a national security context. Because it will unquestionably have impacts. And those impacts are going to be very, very difficult to predict. And so planning and arranging contingencies and just like knowing, again, as we were talking about with Russia and China, knowing how those countries understand climate change, who's going to benefit, what's going to happen. Obviously, there's no way to predict exactly what's going to happen, but planning is really important to national security. And I think that is, to me, most fundamentally, preparedness is critical. And that is why I see climate change as a national security issue and the importance of classifying climate change as a national security issue. I do think, though, that, as we discussed earlier, urgency is a huge part of this conversation. And I think that's why you have Elizabeth Warren, who's not necessarily known for her military expertise, asking these questions of the Army Chief of Staff at a hearing. She obviously wants to, and I don't mean to single her out, a lot of people want to use the urgency of national security to their advantage. And I do think that they're not wrong that urgency is called for and that urgency is necessary in this context where even the Paris Agreement, if fully implemented, is not going to put us on track to reduce emissions as fast as we need to. Now, I'm really ambivalent about that because using climate change as a national security issue is actually outcome neutral. One way to understand calling climate change a national security issue is to think about it as time is running short, let's mobilize to reduce emissions in order to avert a national security crisis. But it can also support other politics.
Including the opposite politics, right?
The exact opposite politics.
Let's only think about the national security consequences, mitigate those, and let the rest of the world, we'll just absorb the impacts as long as we can deal with the national security impacts. The rest of it is just human costs. Exactly.
Climate change, we literally cannot unilaterally stop it. The United States cannot by itself do anything about this. By definition, let's build the wall, start arming ourselves to the teeth to ensure that we have access to natural resources and through the use of our world-class military if necessary. It's called the politics, I believe it's called the politics of the lifeboat. So in that sense, it really is important for us to make sure that we clarify that while climate change is a national security threat, we shouldn't think of it exclusively through a national security paradigm.
All right, I want to talk about one other area where I think it is super useful to think of this through a national security lens, and you alluded to it briefly before, but I want to flesh it out particularly, which is migration. The population density in the areas of the world that are most likely to be most affected and to be made most uninhabitable is generally higher than the population density in the areas that are going to who are going to be less affected. And my joking example of mass migration from Bangladesh to Siberia is only sort of a joke, in the sense that I do think we're going to see, as a result of areas of high population density that are low-lying and hot becoming less and less habitable, people will move out of them, and people will go to places that are or try to go to places that are less population dense, less hot, and less low-lying. And the result of that it is reasonable to expect, will be conflict. I mean, obviously it is more complicated than that, but it seems to me that one of the particularly useful things about thinking about climate in the national security context, it forces you to think about the consequences of migration, which we're already dealing with in a national security framework.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I personally view migration as the most certain and potentially most disruptive consequence for national security of climate change. So when we talk about conflict, whether it's interstate or intrastate conflict, it's really kind of impossible to predict and is always mediated through institutions. So a really good example, I think, is the drought in the Middle East, which I don't mean to pick on the Army Chief of Staff guy. I keep bringing him up, but he recently he pointed to Syria and said, we know that the Syrian civil war was, like, long-term, one of the underlying causes of that conflict was drought. And that is true, but Jordan and Lebanon experience the same drought, and they're not in a conflict. They're not in a civil war right now. So it is true that conflict may or may not arise from climate change, but one thing that is 100% certain to happen is huge and possibly unthinkable waves of migration. So the UN has estimated that there will be up to 200 million climate refugees by 2050. The World Bank has said that we could see 140 million internally displaced persons as a result of climate change. And it's not, by the way, just going to be in poor countries, although they will bear the brunt of it. Internally, there were a lot of internally displaced people after Hurricane Katrina in the United States. But the real issue is that, for me, we have no way of dealing with this issue internationally. There's no easy recognition for this category of people under international law, which makes sense because if you think about it, climate-induced migration is not a single category of migrants. You have people who are going to be displaced by storms and extreme weather. Some, but not all, natural disasters will result in displacement. You'll have people moving due to long-term climate shifts. You'll have people moving due to conflict exacerbated by climate change, some of which migration will be voluntary, some of which will not be voluntary. And in cases of some of these low-lying South Pacific nations, you'll have people displaced by rising water that literally will not have a country anymore, or at least no more territorial country or territorial country in their traditional homeland.
Okay, but I mean, it seems to me that you've just put your finger on something that's a bit of a puzzle here, right? Which is you're going to have all these people who are migrating ultimately as a result of climate. And with the exception of the people whose islands are disappearing, we will generally not attribute it to climate, right? So the Syrian civil war is a really interesting example. This is probably climate change is one driver behind this conflict. And yet nobody thinks of the Syrian refugee problem, except you, as a climate-induced problem. People think of Syrian refugees as induced by the Arab Spring, though Bashar Assad being a brutal dictator, right? A crackdown, a failed revolution. People have all kinds of descriptors for that, and yet we very instinctively talk about it more in terms of the proximate causes than in terms of these long-term drivers. And so my question is, to what extent and over what time frame will it be obvious enough that these migration effects are climate related that we actually attribute it to that rather than to the more proximate causes that, when people get up in the morning and say, okay, I'm going to leave Guatemala and, go to the southern border of the United States, which is, by the way, a climate-driven migration, among other things, we actually think about it that way rather than thinking about it as a, gang pressure thing or a, coffee harvest thing or, all the other things that are kind of more immediately, proximately causal with respect to those migrations.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And I guess I would just flip it back on you and say, what turns on attribution? Why do or do we not need to think of these people who are moving as driven by climate? And I think the answer to that is for refugee law purposes. If we want to give these people some protection under international law or even under domestic law, we sort of want to know. I guess my response to that is it doesn't really matter at this particular moment in time because refugee law does not currently accommodate probably any of these people except for the people from the Marshall Islands.
No, but I think there's another reason why the attribution matters, which is that if your argument is, and I think it is, and I certainly share it, that we need to deal with the emissions problem in order to avert the worst consequences of these national security effects, that the more we can tell ourselves as we see the national security effects that they're actually caused by other things, the less we are forced to say this is a climate effect, the easier it is to deal with the proximate causes or think you're dealing with the proximate causes and avert your eyes from the actual driver.
Yeah, I guess that is always political to me, and we can continue until, if the question is, when will we no longer be able to deny that refugees and migrants are being driven by climate change? I think that factually we're already there, but I think if the question is politically, when will we get there? The answer is whenever we want to get there. And I don't personally think that refugees and migrants are going to be the thing that flips the switch for us. And I think that by the time we are in such a state that it is there's unstoppable migration, basically, I don't quite want to say this because I don't mean it to the full extent of what I'm about to say, but at that point, it's probably not going to matter because we'll probably be seeing the effects of climate change from emissions that we released decades ago. The problem with climate change is that the cause and effect are so far separated. So by the time we start seeing the effects, both on the atmosphere and on migration in a way that is just completely undeniable, even to people who continue to deny climate change in the face of literally 100 years of science, it will be too late because there are certain processes that we can reverse and there are certain processes that we can't. And by that time, I'm going to guess that the oceans are so acidic that many ecosystems will have collapsed, that the ice sheets will be so destabilized, if not melted, that we will not be able to put them back together, even if we're shooting up sulfates into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight to physically cool the earth. That doesn't stop other geophysical processes. So it's a really dark place if you want to end here, but I think by the time the refugee crisis gets so bad that it is completely undeniable, and I would argue we're already there, but obviously not everyone agrees, it'll probably be too late to actually manage the climate at a level that is safe for everyone on Earth.
On that cheerful note, Michelle Melton, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Thanks this week to Michelle Melton for coming on the show. If you haven't yet, please take a second to share the Lawfare podcast on social media and give us a 5-star rating and review wherever you found us. You can also purchase Lawfare swag at our online store, www.thelawfarestore.com. The podcast is edited by Jen Patiahal, and our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thanks for listening.